Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on examples from the United States of shelters that are becoming more housing focused and have become more housing focused and transformed in their delivery of ending homelessness. My name is Ian DeYoung. I'm the moderator today, and I will turn it over to, I believe, James to make his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Ian. Hello, everyone from across the country. Je ne sais pas s'il y a des francophones parmi nous, mais bienvenue à notre webinar. This is going to be a really exciting. I think we've got 2 full hours together, 90 minutes or 2 hours. I think, Ian, together to really discuss an issue of such importance for us in the shelter community in Canada. So I'm James Hughes. I'm the president and CEO of the Oldbury Mission here in Montreal. I just took the reins in September of last year from my predecessor, Matthew Pierce, who says hello to everyone. I'm the co-chair of the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network with Sandra Clarkson from the Calgary Drop-In. She'll be with us in the next few minutes, but she couldn't be here right off the top and apologizes for that. We've got an agenda that you can see on the screen today that has some introductions, presentations, and then we'll get into some Q&As from everybody. I think Ian will walk us through the mechanics of this, but I just wanted to say a word before passing it back to Ian, who of course is the country's Sherpa when it comes to the transformation of our organizations into being increasingly housing focused. That the CSTN, so the Shelter Transformation Network, it's fairly new, of course. We're just been around for about 18 months. It's been an idea that's been coming for a while, but I think it's really with these webinars and some work that we have in mind going forward, really it'll start to take I think an increasingly relevant place in our work. As you know, it is focused on trying to support shelters as they start to think about how to get outside their 4 walls and making sure their clients have pathways to housing, including, in many cases, the management of their own housing portfolios. Some of our aims are to articulate a housing-focused role for shelters in ending homelessness, acting as the voice for shelters in the media and in policy discussions, developing research and toolkits to support shelter transformation, of course, developing a community of practice between us, and the only other one I'd mention is developing a set of national guidelines and targets and potentially even certification around what it means to be a housing-focused shelter. That's a really exciting project. More to come on that in the months ahead. So that's the network. That's who I am. I think we have determined the order of our speakers. Ian, I'm not sure if I'm introducing our speakers or you are. I'm obviously delighted to do that, unless you'd like to do it.
You are, James, and I'll add a few editorial comments as each person gets ready. So over to you for the introductions of the speakers.
Fantastic. I think I'll introduce all 4, and then they can just go one after the other. I think that's how we're going to do it. So we're absolutely delighted, first of all, to have Cicely Dove. Cicely is dedicated to a life as a servant leader, has worked in human services for over 20 years. She is currently the Vice President of Family Services for Crossroads, Rhode Island. She provides strategic direction and leadership in the oversight, administration, and management of the Family Services Department, which includes statewide coordinated entry, emergency family shelter, a domestic violence program, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. Cicely, welcome from Rhode Island, where my sister-in-law lives, by the way. So, love Rhode Island. Number 2, second in the lineup is going to be Brandy Menino. Brandy is the Chief Executive of Hope Services Hawaii, a faith-based organization working towards ending homelessness on Hawaii Island, where experiences are rare, brief, and non-recurring. Those are absolutely beautiful descriptions. Hope Services provides a continuum of homeless programs, including 10 shelter facilities with a 200-bed capacity and a 70% exit rate to permanent housing. Under her leadership, she led the launch and implementation of her community's coordinated entry system, as well as the transformation of her agency's operations from charity to housing-focused practices. John DeCarmine. Welcome, John. John serves as the Executive Director of GRACE, a one-stop assistance center for low-barrier emergency shelter in Gainesville, Florida. He oversees emergency and permanent housing programs, strategic planning, and visioning. His work is guided by two core principles: that everyone deserves a safe place to call home, and the idea of human beings sleeping on our streets is not normal, but rather an unacceptable indication of policy failures and broken systems. Beautifully said. Last and certainly not least, Chris Freed is with us, all the way from the Southwest. Chris leads LA Family Housing. Under her leadership, LA Family Housing has expanded programming to support a 70% increase in providing supportive services and housing over the last 3 years. Chris was also integrally involved in the development, implementation, and rollout of the coordinated entry system for families in Los Angeles, and actively sits at several policy tables, including the Continuum of Care Board, to ensure we are designing policies that align to the needs of its most vulnerable neighbors. So those are our four speakers. It's really a star lineup. Thank you so much for joining us from the US. And over to you, Ian, to get us going.
Thanks, James, and my thanks to the speakers. All are people that I've known for a number of years and hold in remarkably high esteem. These are all accomplished professionals that have worked through some of the issues in becoming housing focused and continue to provide thought leadership on ways that we can continuously improve in this space. These are all individuals who are leaders in their community, and if you haven't been to national conferences in the United States, they and their organizations are often featured in those national conferences, given the work that they're doing. I've asked Cicely to start us off today because I've known her a number of years, and the work of Crossroads has really been an inspiration to many other shelters across the United States in terms of what is possible in really being living a values-driven culture towards preventing and ending homelessness. So with that, Cicely, I'm going to ask you to pop up your screen, and away we go.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian. Let me presentation mode. That's not right. Okay. Thank you all. It is with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to be on such a great panel with such amazing leaders doing great work. And honestly, anything Ian asks us to do, we're there. So as Ian said, my name is Cicely Dove, and I am the Vice President of Family Services for Crossroads, Rhode Island. And I want to briefly just take you on the journey that Crossroads underwent as we really became a housing focused organization, and really not just our shelters, but really our whole service orientation. So Crossroads' mission is to help homeless or at-risk individuals and families secure stable housing. They achieve this by engaging in a range of services, including housing, basic needs, shelter, case management, referrals, and education and employment services. And really at the start of the process, which I'll get into our timeline, our mission changed as a result of this process, really to be more focused on being client-centered and focused on housing as the solution. So the values that Ian referenced, Crossroads really operates by 3 core values. They really are the foundation of everything we try to do, our policies, our engagements, our services, and they are safety, respect, and effectiveness. And we've often told folks, if you need to make a decision, change a policy, use the values as your guide, and you can't go wrong. And so really promoting an environment free from physical and emotional harm, ensuring a feeling of safety and security for all, acknowledging the intrinsic worth of every person, and really for effectiveness, delivering services and managing the organization with efficiency, professionalism, innovation, and accountability. And so just some fun facts, kind of boring about Crossroads. Founded in 1894 as Travelers Aid, seeking to provide aid to travelers, go figure. And in 2001, changed our name as we began to expand our services and be really focused on helping folks experiencing housing crisis. We are a nonprofit organization. We have about 200 employees now, and our annual budget is a little bit higher. We are the state's largest provider of individuals and families experiencing homelessness, and really provide an array of services on our staffed and open 24 hours a day. 2014, we implemented our Housing First Focused. So here's our journey. So in 2012, my boss, and actually the president and company CEO of the company, attended a national conference, and they came in contact with a very precocious, very outspoken Canadian consultant who they were very impressed by, and they had an aha moment. I'm sure it wasn't anything by what Ian presented, but realized that Crossroads was really good at managing homelessness, but not ending homelessness. And so it was really at that pivotal point where we begin to journey to becoming who we are today. And so it was a really a paradigm shift where we wrote new job descriptions and trained all our staff. Ian probably was in Rhode Island, I don't know, probably 5 times that year and the following after, unveiling and implementing and training the importance of having a housing first focus to end homelessness, and really really being able to be able to solidify and alleviate the fears and concerns that staff had of doing the things that they've always done. And in 2014, the new model was implemented. We talked about it as flipping the light switch. And really, through much counsel and calls and sessions and really seeing the wins, we started to see some really great gains after about 2 full years of having a housing first focus. And so really what that entailed is helping our staff be oriented of the thought process of clients no longer had to be ready for housing. That ready meant that they were experiencing homelessness and that they were living, right? That was it. That's where the standards were, that they didn't have to be sober, that they didn't have to have income, that they had to have those 2 elements to be ready. And that it was no longer focusing on transactional things like bus passes and showers, but really that all those interaction engagements and service deliveries were focused on creating a housing plan, that was our ultimate focus, that all activities were focused on that. And we in our system use the VI to determine the level of vulnerability to be able to prioritize folks. And that it was all about intentional conversations. Can I have a bus pass? Sure, but let's have a conversation about housing. If folks would call and they would stop by the office, what are you doing for your housing today? So it was a point where we had signs up in the shelter and was reiterated with staff, if you're not talking about housing, you're having the wrong conversation. And so it really took championing that language and shift in culture to be able to see those wins and create the momentum. And so this is funny, but we went from really shifting from having service, I would say program specific, shelter specific programs that would help make shelter living easier, to let's make shelter exits quicker, right? So from having yoga and scrapbooking classes, and there's nothing wrong with that, but really being able to shift those resources and energies into let's have a housing clinic. let's fill out applications. Let's get on the van and go see if we can search out apartments. Having conversations, being really honest about, yes, these are barriers to housing, but let's continue to figure out how to alleviate the barriers. There are resources out there. If not, we have a platform where we can talk about how do we eliminate some of these barriers that folks are experiencing. Become, transitioning from passive engagement, it's about, we will talk about housing at our scheduled case management session every 2 weeks. Two, let's talk about housing every day. It was to the point where folks actually left the shelter because they were talking about housing too much, right? And so that was one of the intended or unintended consequences, that folks found other places to go. And in addition to the language and the staff expectations and the meetings, we also transformed the actual the building, right? So the signage was important. Visual reminders and cues were critical to reinforce that housing is our goal. And so we would often have boards like this, not only of resources, but folks who had recently gotten housing. And so as new folks were coming in, they were like, well, who is Tina and what does that mean? And so that gave us yet another opportunity to talk about our goal and how we can help our families and individuals have their name up on that board as well. And so as a result of kind of all of these, excuse me, activities and processes and strategies, we started to see the synergy that people were actually leaving shelter. Folks were actually getting housed, that our exits to positive destinations started to increase. Go figure, right? And that we were connecting folks with the appropriate housing intervention. That instead of waiting for folks to get housed, to connect them with education and employment right upon entry, we were connecting folks to our education and employment specialists, and they were working in tandem with both the shelter staff and the housing-based case management staff, recognizing that earned income was a key to housing stability. Recognizing the importance to have manageable caseloads, right? Being able to have 80 and 90 families or households on a caseload is unrealistic. So being able to maintain fidelity to that appropriate amount of caseloads to be able to see the outcomes of the client-focused services. Having things pop up. Being able to increase our housing locator staff and rental assistance fund absolutely was a great support and resource in helping continue on and increase our housing focus. And then being able to shift the mindset of we're focused on everybody in shelter. Well, really, the folks with the lower acuity, we're gonna give them just enough support and really focus on the folks with the higher acuity, because we know those are the folks that we want to get into stable housing as quick as possible, because they have the greater need. And so just 2 more slides. So some of the staff, even with the wins that we were seeing and the momentum that seemed to be very apparent in the shelter environments, getting the staff on board continued to be a challenge about, having too much pressure on having folks exit. That this is their home, we have to be understandable. Well, yeah, we do, but this is not their home. And so let's get them to a place which actually is their home, where they can settle in. That the notion that our special population, so we have a program for sex offenders. Well, they're sex offenders, they can't be housed. Well, actually they can, and let's figure out some strategies to do that. And we've been very successful in being able to house that subpop. Clients and staff not being able to know when it's time to close out someone on their caseload, that they no longer need your services, is a good thing. Not a reflection on you, it's a good thing. So let's have them transition on so we can provide someone else who needs your services some more support. I'm sure you've heard this in other communities. Well, the cost of rents are out of control. We have low vacancy. Okay, other continuums are figuring it out. Let's figure it out. What options are there? Well, there's co-housing. Well, there's, do we do project-based units, right? And so being able to mitigate those excuses right up front help minimize the amount of staff resistance that we experience to remove these barriers. And then being able to provide resources for families with absorbent utility bills was definitely a value added to get these families out of the shelter as quick as possible. And so again, using the data to do better, tracking outcomes versus outputs, not tracking showers, but tracking like, okay, what are people doing, right? Utilizing our program metrics in staff performance appraisals. Whoa, right? What it did was create a sense of shared responsibility for what happens in the program. At that point, things started to shift and folks really became to get the mindset of, oh, regardless of the position that I hold in the shelter, I am partially responsible for helping get these folks housed, right? It was really critical to help change that mindset. Providing the data in a way that doesn't look like greed, right? Providing dashboards that we could assess on a regular basis to see if we are meeting the outcomes and the benchmarks that we set forth. And so just to solidify some of the things that I said in terms of the data, as I said, we started our process in 2012. Really, if you look at the first 3 years of our transition, we saw the evidence, right? It's not just qualitative, it is quantitative. We saw the reduction and the length of stay in our first step shelter, in our women's shelter, and in our family shelter, although we saw a little bit of a blip up. And the same thing goes for our clients to our exits to permanent housing. Again, we saw the same thing, that as we implemented and reinforced the strategies of becoming a housing focused program, we saw everything else fall in place. Now, I will not say that we have continued on this trajectory. I mean, there are times when we have to make reinforcing this a part of our normal learning, a part of our consistent training. And so we do this on an annual basis, is reinforcing these ideas. It's not just one and done, because right now it's the pandemic. And so it's like, no, we can't get anybody housed because of the pandemic. Well, yes, we can. So let's do virtual apartment viewings instead of in-person apartment viewings. And we have been greatly successful in getting folks housed.
Thanks, Cicely. I'm just wrapping you up for the sake of time, but I knew that you're near the done. One of the things that I took away that you just said in the presentation, which I love, is if you're not talking about housing, you're having the wrong conversation. I've heard that a few times in my life, and I just love that phrase. It's great. Next up, we're going to ask Brandy to, so Cicely, you can stop sharing your screen. Brandy's going to pull up her screen. Brandy, when she first reached out to me several years ago, said, do you want to come to Hawaii? How do you say no? And then she was clear that it's where she lives is not the place of beaches and surfs up. It's a rainforest. And I was like, still, I'll go. And then meeting some of the most remarkable human beings in the sector, and just so grateful for the experience of having met Brandy in my life, and that she has made me a much better leader and a much better practitioner. So Brandy, welcome, and over to you.
Mahalo. Thank you so much, Ian. I was just so amazed to be here, and thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure. And just listening here at Cicely's story, our story is very similar, because when I first reached out to Ian first connected me to Karen at Crossroads Island, because as the new chief executive at the time, that was my fears of how do I make changes in our community and certainly within my organization and not feel alone as making this big shift in our thinking. Hope Services Hawaii is a affiliate organization of the Roman Catholic Church. I've been here for 20 years. So I started when I was 12. kidding. But as we started as the department, and Hope Services was established by our local bishop here just 10 years ago. So we are celebrating our 10th anniversary. And in preparation kind of for today's, it's not moving. Oh, there you go. Presentation, I just kind of want to give you an idea of the island that I'm from. So yeah, when Ian was thinking of white beaches and palm trees, I was like, yeah, Ian, I live around lava rocks and active volcanoes and forests. So you still want to come to Hawaii? And he said, of course. So just kind of giving you a sense of the island I'm from. I'm from the Hawaii Island or Hawaii County, or the Big Island is kind of the names it's used interchangeably. So it's that Big Island. So if you put all the small islands in Hawaii into our Hawaii County, that's kind of our landmass. We're at 4,000 square miles, or the largest island in the US. I actually didn't know that until I was preparing for this presentation. But we have various terrain, like I mentioned, beaches, lush forests. We have the tallest mountain from seafloor to Mauna Kea. You may have heard of the Mauna Kea mountain when our local Native Indigenous people were trying to save from building our telescope here on sacred lands. Or our active volcano that destroyed 770 homes in our east part of our island in our lower region. So within this 5 years in which I've been a part of this journey in transforming our organization from a place of charity to a housing focus, there were 2 natural disasters and the pandemic. So I had a hurricane that destroyed, again, the most impoverished part of our island, and then our lava flow that destroyed 770 homes in the last 5 years. And kind of to give you an idea of what our county, our island's fair market rent is, or it's like our average rent on our island. I have it here on the screen. And compared to the rest of Hawaii, our island actually is considered the least expensive of across the state. But it's still challenging, but I'll get into that in finding housing. I think I've already mentioned that we manage 10 emergency shelter facilities with a 200-bed capacity. Our goal with the state, which we didn't have 5 years ago, is to set a goal to have folks who are entering our shelters exit into permanent housing within 90 days. So that's kind of been a focus even at the state level. We also, at our capacity, provide supports. We provide rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing in the private rental market, as well as manage 3 project-based sites. So these are our programs listed here on the screen. So we provide a continuum from outreach to shelter to rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. And this journey really started in 2015, much like Crossroads, Sicily at Crossroads, Rhode Island. I had met Ian at a national conference after attending one of his workshops, and also had an aha light bulb moment of really checking in with myself of like, hey, what does our data say? What are we doing? And what can we be doing? And could we be doing this better and more effectively? At the same time, I've also had the opportunity to participate in a network of 8 family shelter providers that our local community foundation had convened beginning in 2014. So I really had this initiative of system of working together as a network, kind of as my safety net with other executives and program managers from 7 other family shelter providers, kind of working alongside and kind of helping to provide that support as well. This is when we adopted truly a housing first approach, where we changed our mindset, because there really was a change in mindset. I think it's first was with the leader believing in it. So I've had to believe it. I had to look into the data to see what are, because like I mentioned, I've been doing this work for quite some time. And am I doing am I leading in a way that's effective and helpful, or am I getting in the way and making people's lives not helpful and getting them into housing not as quickly? So I was kind of looking at all of that, like what is our practices, and really what stuck out still till today is really focusing on our data and our data practices. So much like what Cicely said, we were required by our funders to track, how many clothing pieces, how many laundry services we did, how many food we gave out. Those are all the outputs, and really worked with our government partners to say, does that really all matter if we're moving into a housing focused way? Like there really is 3 data metrics that matter. Our length of stay, our exit rate to permanent housing, and the return to homelessness. So to kind of understand where we were again, we were a zero tolerance shelter provider. We had 10 pages of rules, 150 of them, where they had to sign an initial every single line. We searched bags, we did UA tests prior to their entry, we set curfew. So we did quite a bit of things that was very not housing first. We gave out notices and violations. So it's really more about social control. After hearing and observing and looking what we were doing and assessing and moving into a housing focused way. So now we already only have 3 expectations. That they abstain from behavior that's disruptive, keep the unit clean, and that Hawaii has a designated smoking area law. So as long as they smoke 20 feet away from open windows or areas. So these are really the 3 expectations. When I think back about transitioning from the 10 pages to these 3 expectations, boy, there's quite a bit of conversations with the shelter staff, how are we going to address this behavior? What about this? And how about that? And so we really had to dive into how each of those rules transferred and converted or transformed into these expectations. They're like, yeah, that's the same thing as their behavior. Yep, that rule too, that's the same thing that relates to their behavior. So we really had to go through that conversation of how practically they would be able to implement this as we move forward in our journey in transforming to a housing focused shelter. The transition was not easy. We really had to, at the time, I had probably about 60 employees. And of that, majority of them were in the shelter because it's 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so we really worked on our shelter team at first and making sure that they understood what we meant, worked with the leadership, talked through concerns that the shelter had. Because we were giving out, like I mentioned, violations, and having conversations like, well, at what time do you guys kick them out? 10 violations, 100 violations? And so we really was like, no, we had actually had to set a policy of like, we are not allowed to give out violations. And if there's a point where you feel like you need to have a conversation, so it's quite a bit of supervision in implementing this and reframing in a different way of how to address the concerns the staff had in implementing a situation or addressing a situation at the shelter, and still making sure that we value, much as Cicely said, respect and people's safety. So really had to continue, and we still continue to do harm reduction and crisis intervention and housing first training throughout the year. It really was an opportunity. Instead of terminating, that's the time we would use that opportunity to create or talk about what's their housing plan. Once we felt like we had a footing on our shelter transformation, we also worked on the rest of our programs that we offered, our street outreach, our housing programs. And when I say change, like we changed job descriptions, went from an outreach specialist to housing navigators, to our street team on the streets. Our emergency shelter was in our community. We were always the first call, and we'll just automatically put them into our shelter, but really have been developing our diversion program in the last few years to have problem-solving conversations at the phone call, that it's not the first automatic send somebody out to to talk with a household with at risk and put them into our shelter, but really helping them to problem solve their situation and keep them in their housing. So we know that we want to use our shelter services as a last resort and not their final destination, as part of the journey and getting them into housing. So again, we reframed job descriptions, really gave them incoming new staff as well, a real life idea of what it's like to work in this field, and didn't sugarcoat it at all. We'd let them know in the job description that, oftentimes you may be spit at or, yelled at or cursed at. None of that language was in our job description before, but we wanted to make sure that those who are entering our Ohana, our team and our family, that they would know that this work is hard, and we're on a focus on housing and having that conversation. So like I had said earlier, we really needed to focus on our data. So one was gathering the right data and what it looked like, and really using that with the team and with my leadership, as well as the staff throughout the organization, that their work was fruitful, that what they're doing in working through the implementation of this transformation is working. So really had to share these data dashboards on a monthly basis, celebrating those the wins, adjusting practices if there were shortfalls, but it really was continuing to have that message throughout the organization that what we were doing was working, and showing what our data looked like prior to transforming, of how homelessness was rising and increasing in our community.
Randy, if we can just 1 minute, just going to bring it to conclusion, that'd be great.
Okay. I think that's it. Yeah, so that was the last one. So organizational change was, so again, it was just celebrating staff and making sure that they're just really focusing on their work and their struggles and challenges, and helping them to feel like they can do this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brandy, and really appreciate your insights. And I appreciate just the compassion that you demonstrate in the journey and what you've made. Next up, we're going to have Grace, John and Jeff. Are you presenting as well, or just John? Anyway, John and Jeff are here from Grace. John is going to do the talking. Grace in Gainesville, Florida, an organization that are like these. They remind me so often of a scrappy startup sometimes. Give them a problem, they're going to lean into it until they fix it, and they're really making a difference. John, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for having us, and I'm just so pleased to be alongside so many other folks that we've learned from along the way. Crossroads, I keep hearing this recurring theme about how many people have turned to them for guidance along the way, and how many people's lives are better for it. So hope that everybody can get as much out of this as we have along the way. I'm going to kind of focus more on the cheerleading part of this, and the why this is so awesome and what changes we've seen. And I want to use that to kind of tie together, what we've taught our staff, how we've led our staff, and what that's looked like along the way. So when we started, before we became Low Barrier in 2016, I don't even remember what our mission statement was, but it was something like, Grace exists to serve and coordinate services for people without housing. And it was 3 paragraphs long, and nobody really knew what it was. Nobody knew what our core values were, because there were about 35 of them, and they were, honesty and accountability and empathy and intention and all of this stuff. We've boiled all of that down to start with to say we're on a mission to end homelessness. Our mission is to end homelessness, and there's a little bit more of it, but whenever any of our team has some question about what it is they should be doing on a particular day, should I be helping this person with a toothbrush, or should I be helping figure out a housing application, we tie all of that right back to the mission. So which one of those is more likely to end somebody's homelessness? And that I think has been one of the critical things, where we try to make things as easy as possible for people to do all of the work that they need to do to remain low barrier and housing focused. A little bit about us, as Ian said, we're in Gainesville, Florida. We are the swampy armpit of the United States, and everything you've heard about us lately politically, sadly, is true. We're a college town, about 250,000 people in our community. We had, up until recently, more than double the rate of long-term chronic homelessness as anywhere else in the state or around the country. Our rate of chronic homelessness was about double, in large part because we exist on a 25-acre campus that had been surrounded by a 250-person homeless camp that our city set up and then just kind of let go. And it, in effect, it just manufactured chronic homelessness in our community, where people were going, they could come to our housing focused shelter, or they could go stay in the woods. And there were these alternatives that existed that really didn't help us have the kinds of conversations we were hoping to have, because people always had this easier out right behind them. And we are in the process of closing that down. I'm pleased to say that as of today, we've reduced the roster in that homeless camp by about 90%. There are 15 people remaining to be housed. We've done all of that with more than 130 permanent housing placements and without one single arrest. So that kind of gives you a little bit of context. We are also the first point of contact for about 70% of the people who are becoming homeless in our community. So if you become homeless, for 7 out of 10 people, Grace is the first place that you're going to come. We're on a 25-acre campus. We took over a former prison, and we do operate using a one-stop model. So while all of our services are optional, other than working on a housing plan, we do have everything ranging from representatives from government agencies to sign up for food assistance or disability assistance, all the way through a computer lab, a women's safe space. We do have a yoga class, but it's not required. And it's, you know, that we use that actually as a way for to bring donors and volunteers in and get them more connected with our mission. All of our work starts with the basic assumptions that you see here. Nothing really that crazy or radical, but I'll tell you what, I started off as a volunteer with a group called Food Not Bombs way back in like 1996. And year in and year out, we were serving the same meal and giving the same blanket and the same pair of socks to the same people. And very quickly, we realized that we were all managing homelessness. We didn't know any better. And once we did know better, we started making some changes. But even back then, you know, our community has always been very compassionate, been very focused on making sure people's needs were met, but we never really ratcheted up to say, well, hey, let's actually get you off of the street. So these assumptions drive everything that we do. Just for your reference, these are our campus expectations. They boil down to 7 things, and those were also reduced down from 2 pages of stuff. We started off thinking that we were low barrier, and we were, and then we were kind of sneakily low barrier as well, when we had, you know, local funders who said, well, this is great, but I can't possibly give you money unless you're doing background checks and urine checks and all these different things for people. And we had to come up with some really creative ways to address that. For example, saying, well, yeah, we do a background check on everybody. We Google them. But then once we've done that, it doesn't preclude anybody from receiving services. But we had to find a lot of really creative ways of appeasing the needs of the people who were funding us, until we came back to them and said, okay, here's what we've actually been doing, and look at our housing placements compared to where we were. And so if you're having those conversations, there are a lot of great ways through that can get you on the right track to do to provide services in the proper way. And let me say, as I'm sitting here with these amazing colleagues, I think we're only like 3 days past the point where I think we've been doing this well for longer than we'd been doing it imperfectly. And we are still doing it imperfectly in a lot of ways. When I see the shelter exit rates, I want to be really transparent. Like, our positive housing exit rate right now is it hovers around 35 to 40%. And we are pulling that up, but there are different stages in this process. And man, I can't wait to show up next time with a slide that says we're at 92% positive exits. So here's the part where I want you to pay attention. And maybe if you're not sure what it is about this that is really worth all of the work and all of the effort, these are our monthly housing placements from the time we opened in 2014 all the way up through, I think, the end of 2020. And you can see there's a consistent increase, but early on, we had been averaging 13 housing placements a month. And that was a crapshoot. That wasn't like we were tailoring our services to meet the needs of people in our shelter. We were providing the same services to each and every person in our shelter. And as luck would have it, it worked well for 13 people a month. It didn't work well for the other 80 or 90 people coming through our shelter. And that was one of the key things that we wanted to change. So you can see just from the moment we went low barrier, we started bringing in more people, and we started having access to people who had been prevented from receiving services. The language that I've heard that probably came from Ian is that folks out on the street had either rejected or been rejected by the existing homeless provider network. And we weren't quite aware of how much we were a part of that. We were committed to low barrier practices, but I think at this point where you see on the slide is about where we started really being fully low barrier. And that includes, what the National Alliance to End Homelessness calls people, or they talk about pets, property, and partners. And of course, we talk about that in terms of people too, and how we're engaging with folks. So there's that initial shift to low barrier, but then shortly after we made the shift to imperfectly implementing housing focused sheltering. That spike that you see immediately after that, it turns out that all those folks were really primed and ready to get into housing if we only delivered services the appropriate way. So we had this initial bump. Two different things happened there. One, we had an initial bump where we were starting to have more housing conversations. We were intentionally delivering the right level of intervention to people rather than just giving everybody that same service. We also dropped our length of stay from 90 days to 30 days. And when we did that, we almost immediately saw about a 20% increase in housing placements. And I have often equated that to when a teacher would tell me I had 8 weeks to write a term paper, I would start at about 7 weeks and then, work overnight for 5 days in a row and then turn it in. But if that same teacher told me that I had a week to turn this in, I was probably going to get started that day. And so we have a stated length of stay policy of 30 days. Now that can be extended again and again and again if somebody is making progress on a housing plan to the best of their ability up to 90 days. And even then, when we exit somebody, they can come back in and try to get a bed the very next day. So there's no point where we say, well, you tried once and you can come back in 3 months and try again. We're still working to get people back in, but it creates that it creates sort of an intentional disruption in their comfort level in shelter. And it creates this moment where they say, well, gosh, it would actually be less work for me to just work on this housing plan with a case manager than it would for me to pack up all my stuff, carry it over here, and then come back tomorrow. So we try to balance and almost present this menu of choices to people where we say, you have this option and you have this option. We hope you take the best option. Or the one that we think is most likely to end up with you in housing. However, you've got all these opportunities. So once we went to that shift to housing focused, then you see this decrease. And that's after we got all of the easier to serve folks, and maybe that's not the right language, all the folks with fewer barriers to housing where we were able to just throw what we had available, work with them, and it turns out they just needed some low-level intervention. Well, then suddenly we were like, oh God, now what? Now we just have a shelter filled with long-term shelter stayers with health problems and with, dozens of barriers. So that's where we really had to start getting good at being housing focused, when it wasn't just delivering what we were going to deliver, but instead it became not only those intentional conversations, but we started to, Jeff can talk more about this in the question and answer. Jeff is the master of difficult conversations. And he is just so good. He's been such an influence on me in how to do that and how to deliver, conversations about housing that don't even necessarily seem like they're about housing sometimes, but they're all about building rapport, having some expectations laid out, and then having enough of a relationship with somebody where whether they're sitting there saying, you know what, I don't want to do this, never mind, or if there's an escalation, there's always somebody on campus who knows enough about their story to walk up and intervene and keep it from backsliding. We also, at this point, started shifting toward cross-team collaboration. And while that sounds like a fancy buzzword, what that basically means is everybody here is involved in getting people into housing. So that could be the person collecting data at meals who's standing in line. Jeff actually uses a tool called Asana, where he's firing out tasks for people that they can check off on their phones about, hey, you know, Mr. Smith went to go speak to a landlord this morning, ask how it went, see, you know, make sure he went. Did it happen? Did it work well? Did something come up that is going to be a barrier? How can we address this? Last night, our evening chef was loading up the box truck and helped move 2 people into housing. A lot of this came down to there was some resentment on our team early on, where there was just this look at the case managers and they were like, they had the sexiest part of the work. Like, why do they get to be the ones who move people into housing? And how come I have to be the one who asks somebody not to smoke in the bathroom? You know, how do we take our mission and make sure that everybody feels a part of it? And a lot of that came from shifting our teams around to make sure that everybody was involved in the housing process, not only because we needed more eyes and ears and people working with folks on the ground, but also because we wanted to have it be like, I think Cicely said, where people were just being bounced from housing conversation to housing conversation. And at some point it becomes easier to get housed than it does to avoid all of those conversations. And then moving on, you know, overall, what I hope you take from this is before we were low barrier and housing focused, we were averaging about 13 housing placements a month. We've had as many as 60 housing placements in a month. The tail end of this is the pandemic. We had to drop to 50% shelter capacity, but even then we still managed to move 350 people into permanent housing last year. And our housing retention rate right now is about 94%. So for every 100 people we move into housing right now, 94 of them will still be in housing a year later. And I got just a couple more things I want to just tell you about our community. So 15 years ago, we had nearly 1,000 unsheltered folks. We had only 65 emergency shelter beds, and most of them were empty because you had to pay for them or pass a drug test or pray before you ate at those shelters. We were not seeing the shelter beds that were available being used. And in fact, that became a huge problem for us funding wise, because we would say, hey, we need more money for shelter. And they'd say, what are you talking about? You're only at 50% capacity. So just a couple of years ago, we had cut the number of unsheltered folks just about by half, by about 48%. All of our shelter programs operate now at just under 100% capacity. And what that looks like for our community-wide network of providers is that we've reduced homelessness by 1/3, but we're serving 3 times as many people in the shelter system. So we are making these shelter beds and these limited resources available to more and more people, despite having fewer people around. There are 1,500 people who went through shelter in our continuum of care in 2018. Then finally, I just want to end with this quote. I'm not going to read it to you, but you know, in terms of why we do this, back to the conversations I was having with people in parks in 1996, you know, there is a decision that has to be made in the work that we are doing as advocates that ties into who gets served. And I am a staunch, firm believer that everybody is ready for housing now. Our team all believes that. And everybody deserves a shot at the services that we have to offer. So as we're setting up policies and expectations, the goal for all of that has to be to recognize that whatever challenges somebody may present with, the work that we do in response to that says more than anything else about ourselves and our organizations and about the change we want to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate your time. I gonna ask you to stop sharing your screen. Chris, you can pop yours up. For the folks from Grace, they are perpetual great problem solvers, and they dig into the complex conversations. Really excited Chris could join us. I know we're going a little bit over time here, folks. You don't want to miss this. Chris has been a great friend and colleague for many years. I sometimes refer to her and her family as my Southern California family. They've been so generous and great to me. And so, Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Just give me a thumbs up. Today is the day in about 30 minutes. I drive in my car to get my second vaccination, which I hear is kind of brutal. So kind of happy to be on this instead of on that. But anyway, so I too, and I don't know why it's not moving for me here.
Bottom left-hand corner, there's an arrow.
Yeah, there we go. Yep. So, so we're just going to go over today, and I'm going to try to be really quick. I have a ton of slides, so I'm just going to fly through some of them relative to what other people have already talked about, so that I don't repeat. But really just kind of going over who we are as an agency, and then how we moved from not being focused on housing placement to being focused. Quick look at our narrative, and then really around the honest housing narrative that needs to happen in all of our sites. So just for those that don't know, and just a little bit different than my colleagues on the phone. So LA Family Housing is, or where we're similar, is that we do everything from street outreach all the way through real estate development. And in our portfolio, we have 27 properties. We have 4 that are under construction right now, and another 12 that are in the pipeline over the next 5 years. And just brought on for what is being called Project Home Key, so hotels being converted. So 4 more that we just took on as well. Our organization is about 75 million a year, and we just hit, just on the services side, 400 employees, but our total organization is about 470. Okay, so key components to housing focused shelter is really around making sure that all shelters are using a housing first approach, that your services are all housing focused and the conversations are happening that way, and that you're really tracking and making sure that everyone that's leaving is moving into permanent housing. So prehistoric times at LA Family Housing, 2013 or 2010 through 2013, because I met Ian, I think in 2011 actually, and brought him to LA. And to at a national alliance when he was actually presenting at 7 a.m. in the morning. And I said, hell no, I'm not getting up at 7 o'clock. But I did, and it was the best presentation. There were people outside the door. And so I pushed my way through as I normally do, and got in and said, oh my God, this guy's got to come to LA. Because these were our numbers, and we thought we were doing amazing work. That essentially we had folks with moderate acuity, at best. We thought we were serving the hardest to serve. We did serve everyone that everyone else turned away, but we didn't even understand what it meant to bring people in from the streets that wouldn't otherwise have a conversation with us and really engaging with them. We had no turnover. Our outreach, we didn't have the outreach, and our average permanent housing placement numbers were something like 27 for families out of 85 units, and we were placing about 30 individuals out of a 250 person shelter. And so were we a housing focused shelter? The answer was nope. And I'm going to restrict my language here. Typically I wouldn't do that, but here I'm going to do that. Okay, so you got to let data tell the story. So what do you know about the shelter stays in your community, and how many people are really looking at their community to design the message or to make the changes within their own organization or within their own community to ensure that we move from a shelter that keeps people there until they're well, into moving people into housing immediately and working on all the barriers and challenges they have once they're in housing. Because as we all know, housing first is not housing only. There's services that must come along at the back end to keep people safe. So I actually had notes, but I presented this in the non-note version. And so now we got to go with my troubled brain version of this. So if we're looking at our 2019 numbers, and I'm just going to be honest up front that I think, and everybody else did as well, that we're not as perfect as we want to be, but we use the data to be able to drive the conversation about where we need to go and the changes that we need to make within our own teams and in the messaging that we're providing. And so in 2019, we went to an average acuity of 10. At this point, we weren't 100% prioritizing beds for people that were moving into shelter. We have done that since, but in 2019 we hadn't. And so if you look at this data, what it basically says is that from the 3,159 people that we were serving in shelter beds a year, we saw the vast majority of people that were moving out between really kind of the 4-month and the 12-month period of time. We started increasing it at the 1 to 3 month. And what we know about the less than 1 month was that people were leaving, but we didn't know where they were leaving. And most of them were leaving to self-resolve because they had come into a shelter, a congregate site, and they were like, oh, hell no. Let me go find a better place to live. And so they left and they just didn't provide the information. But what we also saw was that as people started staying beyond a year, that their trajectory out was worse. And when we were looking at our data in 2019, we had several folks that were actually in our shelter, didn't even know it, for over 3, maybe 3.5 years. And so we were like, something has got to give here. And as a housing focused shelter, and especially someone who's been working with Ian since 2011, this is not good enough. We've got to fix this and make some significant changes. So as we moved into 2020, our acuity score rose. And so it rose only by 2 points. I would guess that if we were to look at it in 2021, it would even be higher. But based on the bed turnover, we started prioritizing the people that we deemed in our community based on acuity score that needed the beds, those with the highest acuity, and really started working with those groups and offering up the different sites that we had. What we started to see was that we really moved from being where it was more from a 4 to 12-month period of time. Really, we're starting to see the vast majority of people getting placed between the 1 and the 9-month. And so we're reducing the time. On this one, you will see a significant increase in our long stayers, and that was because we had a housing surge and we were looking at people with super low acuity and even some of the folks with a higher acuity that hadn't been matched yet and got them matched very quickly. But the people with low acuity, gave them the notice that you've got 30 days and that we will work with you really, really hard over the next 30 days, but it's time to go. You cannot stay in these beds. And so we started to see an increase on the long stayers, but that was because it was very intentional relative to the to getting them out as quickly as possible. And so we're now at where we have at our shelter that we have less than 10% that have been there longer than a year, which is incredible for us because, like I said, we had people that were on our site for much longer than 3 years. So we're really using the data to drive our own internal goal planning and messaging, and where there's new dollars, going after those dollars to actually fund the different activities that will help us get to exactly where we need to get in order to get people out quickly, because what we know is the longer they stay in the bed, the harder it is to get them out of a bed. Okay, so determining who has access to a shelter, a lot of people were talking about problem solving and diversion and all of those things, but really, you know, Ian does this really great thing with shelter, and he and I have done this presentation in the past, so I chose not to take his slides, just assuming that those have been shared at another time. But really, where you start to have the foyer, you have the yard, and you have people knocking on the door, and you don't even let them get into the foyer of your house until you're sure that they don't have anywhere else to go. And so really, the only people that should ever be coming in the shelter are those folks that absolutely have no other option. They have tried every single thing that they've ever used in the past or could potentially use before coming in. And now even in this isn't happening across LA, although we're hoping that it does, really trying to prioritize those with the highest needs to make sure that we are serving them and that we're not leaving them out on the street to perish. So, okay, so problem solving, another good friend of both Ian's and a staff person of mine that came from Canada, Aylin, would say problem solving is the intervention and diversion is the outcome. Or the output, and it's really focused on making sure that you're being very intentional in the conversation, that you're empowering folks a lot to be able to make the decisions, not trying to take away from them, but actually give to them that saying no is not a bad thing, it's a good thing, and it's because they have something else, and it might not be ideal, but there's lots of different components that they can take in their life and lots of services externally that we can connect them to that can help them with things like employment. That's not to say that we don't have an internal program within our own organization that helps with employment, but why should we bring somebody in who otherwise can be connected to a community-based organization around employment and bring them into a shelter bed while we're trying to help them get employment, if employment is the only missing piece and they have a friend that they could stay with for a couple of days until they obtain a job. And so we've had some set aside dollars to really help with problem solving in Los Angeles. to be able to help people with food cards or to give food cards to pay somebody's electric bill, or whatever the cost may be, to be able to move them into a friend or family or somewhere that can be temporary, even if it's only a couple of days at a time. It's a couple of days that they're not in a shelter bed. And so these are just all the different places that we talk about. This again is Aylin's the houseboat, the boat life. Never really thought about that one much, but we are in LA. And so much like Brandy out there, and actually Rhode Island, I think, is up against the water too. Oh, Florida, shoot, all of us are on a coast somewhere. I guess that's why we're all here. us lefty people. So, okay, messaging is the most important component. I think John spoke about this a lot. Brandy spoke about this a lot. Cicely spoke about this a lot. The people that actually will screw this up the most for you are your own staff. It's not the participants necessarily that don't want to leave. It's your own staff that are like, I want to coddle this person to death and keep them here and keep them safe and keep them warm and keep them loved and keep them hugged. But people don't need that. People really need to be in their own space where they can flourish and thrive. And this is where I think with LA Family Housing, where we've seen lots of really high acuity folks that actually never needed any form of permanent supportive housing. What they needed was to get into housing. They needed a chance to stabilize a little bit, but have been able to take over their own rent and move on. So your high 12s, 13s, 14s, we have data that we've tracked over the past 4 years to be able to show that and bring that today because different conversation, but super cool that when you give people the space and empower them to have control of their lives, it's amazing what they can do. So changing the conversation is key. I took this from another one of Ian's very good friends from the Salvation Army in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you're not talking about housing, you're having the wrong conversation. The narrative needs to be from every single level, right? The housing first approach and a philosophy and approach, and the interactions must be housing focused. So even if you're doing yoga, somebody said they had a yoga class, that yoga class is talking about, wouldn't it be amazing if you were in your own house and you could stretch out, and you could be naked when you're doing yoga and all kinds of, or hot yoga or cold yoga or whatever kind of yoga, bicycle yoga, dog yoga, I don't know. But these are all really cool things that you can do in your house, and having those conversations while you're doing the activities. To think that you're not doing activities while people are in shelter, it's probably not realistic, but it's just trying to change the conversation relative to everything that they are doing, that you're focusing it on housing. And the same is true for volunteer groups and all of those things for the EDs on the phone or on this presentation. We all need to be able to get volunteers in and donors in, and the way to do that is through these types of activities, but you just change the narrative around the activity. And you need to be able to check in with people every day. So we have participant coordinators. We changed that name from resident advocates for our shelter staff. So we changed the name of participant coordinators to let people know this is a short term, but their job is to go in every single day, make sure they've talked to every single person and see where they're at with their housing plan, just checking up, just checking in, making sure that that things are moving in the right direction, and connecting those with their housing navigation team to ensure quick movement out. And then the diversion conversation is not a conversation that only happens at the front door. It's a conversation that happens every single day, because I think the thing to remember is time heals relationships, and most of the people that may have been able to stay with their family or a friend or had a partner, whatever the case may be, that, you know, months apart, and when people find out that they're in these dire situations, people's hearts start to heal, and time has helped that, and so they may be able to go back and reestablish those relationships. And don't ever take away that because it was a bad relationship for a period of time. I'm not talking about abusive relationship, we're not talking about DV, but where families got into arguments or disagreements, in most cases, time heals those things and people can go back. And so constantly having the conversation. Ian, am I okay on time? I'm trying to hurry it up here. If there's a roommate complaint, if they don't like your food, if they don't like the beds, if people fart, if people stink, if people do all those things, if they don't like you, perfect opportunity to have the conversation, to tell people, time to move on. Let's get you into a better place, in your own place. Then you don't have to smell me, see me, hear me, talk to me, any of those things. Housing focused staff. Cicely talked about this, I believe, in the beginning. I think Brandy talked about this too. And I think some of you guys have even seen some of our job descriptions, because I feel like we've sent them across the country multiple times, but it's really about housing navigation, housing stabilization, engagement from the front end, but the engagement coordination piece that leads it to the housing placement piece, housing location staff. That's what we have. We're not in any way talking about anything else. I don't have a case manager. I don't, but it is a housing navigator. It really takes that role. And so oftentimes it's about trying to make sure that the entities that we're having conversations with, or funders that we're having conversations with, really start to change what they're putting in their applications to people, so that they can tie it into our work and be a unified message versus where we're all pulling from different directions. And talking about case management, when we're talking about housing navigation and thinking we're talking about different things, when we're really not. We're talking about the same thing. It's about moving people into housing as quickly as possible. Words about motivation. So motivation cannot be forced. Motivation and readiness to change is very difficult and beyond the clinical's set of most shelter staff. I do have clinicians within my shelter environment, but I don't have them 24 hours a day. And so really making sure that we're teaching our people that tough love is not necessarily what's needed. It is just making sure that you're consistent in your conversation from the very beginning. And doomsday suggestions don't motivate people. They just scare the crap out of people and freeze them often. So it's about really making sure that I always like this. I say this in stabilization. It's like onboarding to exit plan. The same thing should be happening inside a shelter. That from the second you walk in is the second you're talking about housing, so that there is no doomsday conversation that's happening. Ordering, directing, commanding, warning, threatening, all that stuff I just talked about, not going to be helpful in this, but what is helpful is that you turn that conversation into positive conversations about the things that will be really helpful when they're in their own housing and how you can support them there, because the services also continue there in the same way that they would continue in the shelter environment. Harm reduction, affirm choice and self-determination, empowerment, all of those things that does support the best practice approach, being trauma informed. Those are things that we live by at LA Family Housing. Our common thread is really housing first, trauma informed, and harm reduction policies. And everything that we do, and every rule within the agency, and I'm not a rule person, but even the way we operate finance and our HR department and all of those things have to incorporate the thread of those three things in order to be able to make sure that the services that we're providing to participants are aligned with who we are as an organization. So we've realigned everything within our organization to follow those three principles. And that can be really difficult for your finance team and everybody else, but there you have it. Thank you, Ian, for the opportunity to do this, and for my fellow colleagues on the phone. I can't wait to see you again at the next conference.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks to all of the presenters and to those of you who have joined us today. As I said, we did go a little bit over time to the presenters. I'm also sorry, but wow, what a great amount of information. And if people have to leave, I understand, but we do have a couple of questions that I'm hoping we can just do a rapid piece around. The first question, Brandy, is to you. It says, can Brandy talk more about what the diversion conversations look like at Hope Services?
Sure. So because we have 10 shelter facilities, we actually have one call line so that folks can call into, and we created a diversion specialist position. So having a team, now we have 2 staff. So we talk about, oftentimes we'll have calls like, need to leave, or I'm getting kicked out. And they'll have a series of questions that we would ask, really getting to the root of what's their situation, where they're staying, and asking, just trying to figure out kind of strengths-based and empowering them of finding out what their resources are, if family or friends, if there's something that we could help support the host family if they're there, provide some subsidy, whether it's food, if they're having financial stress in the home, because they're staying with auntie or uncle, but really getting to the root of whatever their situation is and finding if there's some way that we could help that household, again, not come automatically, because that was what it was before, just automatically into our shelter, but really helping them to stay in the housing situation that they're in and continue to work with that person or that household and finding another housing solution if that doesn't work where they're staying at. So just having continued conversations and another like case management support, but really not having them enter the homeless servicing system.
Thanks, Brandy. When we look on the second question, I'm going to bring my friend Jeff into the conversation on this one. This question is, when you're not terminating guests, how do you hold people accountable when they fail to meet shelter expectations or they break the few rules that are in place?
Hello, I'm Jeff. I'm also from Grace. I am the Director of Shelter Services, and I've held all the jobs that you possibly hold at the organization. And so in this specific instance, what I've discovered works best for me is having those conversations with folks about the specific behavior, and it's all in the rapport building for me. Even though I'm the director of the shelter and the programs, I still am out there, building rapport with the guests we serve. And I look at their charts and I look at where their progress is, so I know what they're doing. And so in those, in those times where expectations are broken or escalations occur, I can walk up, call them by their name, and have a really targeted conversation about, what it is and how we expect you to be here at Grace and what we can do to avoid you being exited, because that's the last thing I want you to see is you sleeping on the street. I really want to exit them to housing. And so that's what works best for me.
And I think that's a great point, because one, you do have a grace about how you do it, and not just that the place is called Grace, but it's having the direct conversations. And I think it's one of the things that you and your staff, and the time that I got to know you, I mean, you're definitely engaged in that place. I have a couple more questions I'm going to ask, then we'll bring it to a close. This one's for you, Cicely. Are you ready?
I don't know. Are you ready for what
Well,
I might say?
You've been at this many years now, continuous improvement. Is it worth it? Is it worth the effort to become housing focused?
So, yes, it is. There are days when I ask myself the same question, when I feel like I'm beating my head against the wall, both with the challenges internally, but more so systemically. But yes, it is, because when you see the numbers, right, when the data speaks for itself, and you see the quality of services shift, as well as the expectations of the folks in shelter, which then directly affect the expectations of the guests coming in the shelter. Yes, it is, right? So we've heard the stories of folks who it's been their first apartment. They didn't even know if they would be able to ever have their own keys. And right, you've heard all those touchy-feelies. I'm a big old F on the Myers-Briggs. So we heard all the, we get all the feels from the stories, but it's also backed up by the data. And so, yes, it takes a lot of reinforcement. It takes a lot of championing, and so we're going to continue doing it. It's the right thing to do.
Well, the other thing I love, Cicely, and your data shows us, not just as an organization, but also knowing about a little bit about your program area. There's some people who push back and say, well, it doesn't work with families, right? This might work for individual adults, but it's not going to work for families. And I think you've demonstrated that you can work through these issues. It is possible for families. It might look somewhat different than working with an individual adult, but it is possible.
That's exactly.
Chris, next question for you. Are you ready? Permanent bans, so kicking people out forever. Your thoughts on that?
Hell no. Yeah, it's funny. I just have to tell one short, quick story. PRK, which are these, and Ian's like, please don't use these darn
Project Room
acronyms.
Key.
But PRK is in California right now because of COVID. It's the governor's attempt at ensuring people that are experiencing homelessness are getting off the street, and so it's taking over just tons and tons of empty hotel rooms across the state. And so it's called Project Room Key. So one of my Project Room Key sites, I mean, we're a really large organization. I have a senior team underneath me and then a team of directors under them and lots of managers. But because of how quickly we had to stand these up and everyone being incredibly stretched thin, and then people in and out based on being ill and all of that stuff, I decided I was just going to continue to manage Project Room Key, which Ian knows me, like I'm pretty good with pretty seasoned folks. I'm not so great always with green folks. And so, but I've been managing this team, and I think I've been doing an okay job, except for I walked in one of our PRK sites the other day, and at the very, very top of like the entire like conference room from one side to the other were pictures, and they were beautiful pictures. And I was like, wow, what is that? At the very end, it was like kicked out clients or something, or people, I don't, whatever the word was that they used. But I was like, yeah, no, we don't do that. Take all of those things down. First of all, it doesn't make any sense to have that, because in 2 months, when you have a different staff person, they have no idea that that person was there. Or 2 years from now, nobody, staff turns, nobody knows. And it's not, what are they going to do? Spend an hour going through a book? So that doesn't make any sense. But also because behaviors change. And because somebody had a bad day, a bad month, a bad 6 months, you never know. I use my own story in that, right? When I used to use drugs 100 years ago, and my parents and everybody tried to help me, I had so many no's. If someone had given up, if everyone had given up on me, I might not have ever gotten to a yes. And so people's behaviors change over time, and you never know when that time is going to be. And so having a permanent ban on somebody is absolutely ridiculous, in my opinion. There you have it.
Thank you. I wanted to say a special thanks to the Canadian Alliance and for standing up the Transformation Network, the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network. The special thanks to the co-chairs, James and Sandra, for continuing to promote opportunities like this for learning, and a special thanks to all the panelists for making your time available to share your wisdom and what you've learned in this process, and to help induce hope. So my deepest thanks and mahalo to you. And Brandy has taught me over the years when to use certain words, and I'm getting better. Yeah, I couldn't even do that the first time I went to Hawaii, but look at me now. All right, James, the final word, over to you.
Just on behalf of the practitioners, panelists, thank you. That's super inspiring. I've learned a great deal. You know, from the big things to the crucial importance of data, and even having the systems to gather data. Like we're still you know, that's still a huge work in process at our organization, to little things like the signage that kind of really struck me. Cicely, this idea of, like, you know, signage your place with housing, those kind of physical, the physical presence of memory, so you never forget what you're up to. And I think that's what our network is about, and you've made it richer, and we thank you sincerely for it. Have a wonderful rest of the day, the month, the year. May we all get through COVID, which is overwhelming our lives here in urban Montreal and right across our country. Ce n'est pas facile, as we say here in Quebec. But Ian, as we sign off, we have another webinar coming up. Maybe do you want to say just a word about that before we sign right off completely?
Yeah, I am very pleased to share with you that there is another webinar. It happens on February 12th. The webinar on February 12th is going to be a few Canadian examples of shelters that have transformed / are transforming within the space of being housing focused. James's organization will be featured. Old Brewery Mission, I always get the words wrong in the order, but it is Old Brewery Mission, right? Not Old Mission Brewery, it's Old Brewery Mission. We will also have the Calgary Drop-In Center and Mission Services in Hamilton will be sharing parts of their story. That's a week and 1 day from now. If you haven't signed up, please do so. And just to extend my wishes of a great day for everybody, and be well. Thanks for now.